sense of public truth? That question does not have an easy answer in 1945.
I don't care.
And honestly, it does not have an easy answer now either. It's set up the next part of our
sure about it.
Good father. What happened to Edward Wallace after the Bahamas in
My father.
years of exile? What the estrangements, the letters, and the loneliness of late life regrets is a story
My
about
father.
what it actually costs to choose passion.
He had a big problem.
And who made that choice ever
That's
true.
me,
Some exiles are dramatic. The kind where a person is stripped of everything overnight, forced to feel into the dark. Then there is the other kind, the slow
My father.
exile. The one where you still have a beautiful house
He was
and
the
an
perfect
allowance
person.
for your neighbors. In the world you were made for, it quietly closed its doors to you. And every morning you wake up slightly further from home than you were the day before. That was the life
He
of
went,
Edward Wallace for 25
When he
years.
left school,
And the world looked into it more complicated and in some
My
ways
grandmother.
more quiet and it becomes. The story of their exile really has 3 chapters, and they are nothing alike. The first chapter is the Bahamas. In the summer of 1940, Winston Churchill sat down and wrote a memo with his own hand. He labelled it most secret and personal. In it he wrote that the activities of the Duke of Windsor had been caused himself
pretty well.
and that the Duke's
When he got
inclinations were
back.
known to the Nazi, that he may become the centre of
Yeah,
intrigue.
he left.
The solution was to offer Edward the governorship of the Bahamas, a small British colony in the Caribbean, far from Europe, far from Germany, far from anything that mattered
4 years.
strategically. Churchill went less later on why he chose the Bahamas specifically. It was reportedly quite direct in somewhere
I wanted to find out
out of reach.
The day he left
Distance was the point.
Europe.
The Duke and Duchess arrived in
Grandma's
Nassau on the 7th of
everything.
August 1940.
Everything.
It was
Only
hurricane
that.
season.
The only thing that we had left, we had a letter.
Wearing his Major General's uniform, inspiring heavily. Wallace was impeccable.
We had a letter.
Was always looking as though she had arrived from Garden 91 in full-time exile.
We had
Thousands of Bahamians turned out to welcome him
drawing
singing Tanya.
when he was at
They were light and composed, and privately Wallace was already scratching out to the dress on her stationery. Government
You know,
forced
not much.
Nassau. It said,
Yeah.
Elmer, when
Yeah.
in exile, was first defeat. She later upgraded this record. She began calling Nassau their St. Helena. That was Napoleon's second permanent exile, the one
He, took up
the
the
governor's residence when they arrived contained Victorian-era furnishings infested with termites. The social life of Nassau was where standards Edward and Wallace had known approximately non-existent.
which
Wallace
was
wrote her aunt in September of that year.
yeah, Bill.
Together we go to dish this shack up
Roger,
as
yes,
at least one isn't ashamed of asking the local horrors here. The local horrors, which are
And,
the local social set.
Gave you enough money.
She was describing the language of all
I was thinking
the
about it.
diplomats in the Catholics were in the small Caribbean
And,
island. Yet, here is where the picture gets more complicated. They both actually did their jobs. Wallace organized Red Cross work and influenced welfare. Edward pushed through and
we had golf clubs running around.
400 miles opposed to the outside
Made
of
golf.
20 years. Even the editor of the Nassau Daily Tribune, a man who'd been one of Edward's fiercest critics, wrote
The only thing he did-
in 1905 that he had become convinced the governor had been genuinely trying to do his best for the islands
Like
and the sections of the economy that had long been neglected as self-driven interests.
And he had so many
That
weapons.
is real truth despite relativities. And it tends to get lost in the broader story. Still, they hated it there. Also,
Then I was,
constant surveillance. Top secret Federal Bureau of Investigation documents later declassified and sent to President Roosevelt himself
Dad.
reported that Edward was in a state of intoxication most of the time. Wallace had
Devoted
established
to that.
contact with known German
To
agents. When they reflected for political purposes is disputed by historians. What is not disputed is that Churchill and the King remained deeply uneasy about the couple's loyalties throughout the war. Edward resigned from the governorship in March 1945, 1 month before the war in Europe.
Anyway, the picture had
What some observers at the time called not entirely as a joke, a second mission. So Edward and Wallace returned to France. This is where the second chapter of Exile begins, the non-glittering restless hollow little section. For the first several years they had no fixed home. They shuffled between all of the story that it knew Claridge's when they were briefly in London. It came a point of what was then called Bailey Society, the international world with the fashionable people who attended the same parties in the same cities, whose lives consisted largely of being seen in photograph. That world, Edward and Wallace were fixtures throughout the 1950s into the 60s. Television. They were guests at the White House twice a month.
But I know can't take it back.
They had Charles Lindbergh and Alice Roosevelt bombing them. They were minded to take an external measure. That might have not be down the map of social is. The description of it.
You got a box.
It's one of the most widely based assessments. The whole story. Now describe the Duke's conversation as entirely vacuous. Who's talked about things on Earth. The Duke's got 13 years of purpose, it says, to someone with to say. And no children. Edward's family had lost everything out. He had no career, no infantry, no actual role. He had Wallace. He had his dog, a full they kept close. This detail so small and so human always makes me feel volunteered to open. He had a bedroom lamp studded with small lights, each one marking a place he had visited. During those extraordinary years before everything fell apart, he had a framed collection of regimental buttons from every British unit that fought in the trenches of the First World War, his most treasured possession. He said, which tells you something about the man he wanted to believe he was, even if the man he actually was had grown complicated and controversial over the decades. In 1953, they finally settled into something resembling a permanent home. The city of Paris offered them the Villa Windsor in Bois de Boulogne, 14-room neoclassical mansion surrounded by gardens leased at the equivalent of $50 American a year. Wallace renovated it room by room with the help of Maison Janssen, the legendary Parisian decorating house. She sourced antique furniture commissioned with portraits of herself, of flowers from the garden, fresh daily.
They did.
It was extraordinary. Visitors who came to dinner described being awed by the beauty of the rooms. Wallace was constructed of an artist's statement. Remaining exiled, maybe unwanted by the family and distrusted by the government, quietly shunned its room. We were not diminished, we were not defeated. They also owned a country mill house outside Versailles, the only property they ever purchased outright. Wallace called it our only real home. The main reception room she commissioned. She had these words written, not the villa's daughter, but the mill. I have read that line dozens of times, and I followed it every time I was bumping a check. She was a woman who was in the faithfulness of listen, to destroy her
Get out back.
She was
And then
years around.
bag.
The wind beaten on the burned walls.
Well,
Beside.
yeah.
But I didn't want to expect to Not a reality, not only beautiful, but stranger and more painful than any of it outside.
It's almost as though the other
No relationship,
how
that's sacrificing
you get a bit hard.
quiet and the moving at dinner is the unspoken light of Kept.
In the going out.
Historians who have studied the Windsor marriage in depth suggest as the underlying texture of their life together. Biographer Anne Seeley, answers to letters never been published, described the marriage not as a romance, but as what she called gothic.
He enjoyed
One sugar period of romantic application, Jimmy
And he liked
noted
partying.
events she could not control, and she ended up in Sever's memorable phrase, stuck with an overgrown baby. The man
He liked crowd work.
who had given up a throne to her and therefore held that gift over their relationship as an invisible permanent pressure, who had to be worth it
They'd have dinner
every
parties
day.
after dinner and after
5
drink.
years.
So the guy would be
Edward's love for Wallace was
$45 out there.
It was also total and
Crap.
demanding. And as the years accumulated,
You know, World War II.
he had nothing else.
Oh, well,
She
she,
had to be everything. Wallace, who had always been sharp and brutally social, would thrived on wit and wit, and the company of interesting people,
what
found
room?
herself acquired
Paradise.
and defined by the very devotion that had made her famous. None of this is simple. None of it is simply sad either. There were, by all accounts, genuine warmth and real companionships with them, especially in the early years. They called themselves W, their initials, but also a riff on the royal England that was the captive monarchs speaking to the whole nation. Even in exile, they kept the private joke alive. That is, in its way, rather sweet. Edward died on the 28th of May 1972, throat cancer after a long time. He was
Put on your
77.
Speedo.
Queen Elizabeth II had visited him at the villa 10 days before during a state visit to France. She spent 15 minutes with him.
Well, game
He was too ill to appear in the photographs.
Sunday,
Wallace was photographed at the royal party. 10 days later, he was gone.
stopped by,
His body was flown back to Britain. He lay in state at George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. More than 60,000 people filed past the coffin over 3 days. Wallace came to England for the funeral and the next visit in years, and stayed at Buckingham Palace, the home of the family that had never accepted her.
stopped by,
She was frail, reportedly invisible, barely able to process what was happening. She stood at the graveside of Frogmore within the grounds of Windsor Castle and watched them bury him. She did not speak publicly about it. There are accounts from people who knew her in those days of a woman who seemed in quiet moments not grief-stricken in the expected way, simply lost. Widowhood removed the last defining structure of her life. She had been for 35 years the reason Edward existed outside the palace. Mary was gone, but she was left alone in the villa she had made so beautiful in the portraits she had commissioned. With the flowers she still had refreshing every morning, even though there was basically no one to notice them. The final chapter of Wallace's story is the strangest and darkest of all three, and it is one that most people have never heard. After Edward's death, a French lawyer named Suzanne Bloom acquired power of attorney over the Duchess's affairs. Rachel Bloom was herself a remarkable figure, a former Hollywood divorce lawyer who had the same age as Wallace, but vividly intelligent and yet effective. She had represented Rita Hayworth in her divorce settlement from the Aga Khan. She had negotiated for some of the great figures of 20th century entertainment. She was not a person to be trifled with. But what happened next as Wallace sank into dementia in the late 1970s and early 1980s was deeply troubling. In 1980, the journalist Lady Caroline Blackwood was commissioned by the Sunday Times to write a simple piece about the aging Duchess. What she found instead became the subject of the book. A book so disturbing that it was not published until after Metro Bloom's own death. When Lockwood arrived in Paris to arrange an interview with Wallace, she was told all access would go through Bloom. She met the lawyer. She discovered that Wallace's old friends, people who had known her for decades, had been completely cut off. They had tried to visit. They had been turned away. An Austrian baron who was determined to see the Duchess had managed after sustained effort to get as far as the bedroom doorway. What he saw through the door horrified him. Wallace was curled in what he described as a fetal position, unconscious, her skin dark, shrunken. Metro Bloom told Blackwood contradictory things about Wallace's condition, sometimes that she was frail but comfortable, sometimes that she was in a coma. When Blackwood pressed further, the lawyer reportedly told her with complete composure that if she wrote a single derogatory word about the Duchess, she would not sue her. She would kill her. Meanwhile, Bloom was quietly selling items from the Villa Windsor jewels, furniture, personal belongings to her own acquaintances at below market prices. The Queen's own lawyer was sent from London to Paris to check on the Duchess. Metro Bloom would not let them through the door. Edward had written in his will that he never wanted a single piece of jewellery he had given Wallace to be sold or worn by another woman. When Wallace's estate was eventually settled, she died in April of 1986 at the age of 89. Most of it went not to the royal family, not to her friends, but to the Pasteur Institute Medical Research Foundation. On the instructions of Metro Bloom, a cause that Wallace, by all accounts, had shown zero interest in during her entire life, the jewellery was auctioned at Sotheby's in Geneva in April of 1987. The collection raised $45 million American dollars, 7 times its pre-sale estimate. Every stone Edward had given her, every necklace and brooch chosen for a woman he loved more than a kingdom, went under the hammer in a Geneva auction house and was scattered to buyers from around the world. She was buried at Frogmore beside Edward within the grounds of Windsor Castle, together finally inside the estate that had never quite accepted them while they were alive. When I sit with all of this, the 35 years, the beautiful rooms, the painted joke on the Millhouse wall, the jewellery auction, the woman curled in the bedroom, I find myself returning to a question I cannot fully answer. What does it mean to choose love over everything else? Not in the film version where the credits roll before you have to see what happens next, but in the real version where you live inside that choice through decades of mornings and evenings and seasons, watching the world carry on without you wondering whether what you built was enough. Edward seems to have believed until the end that it was. There are accounts of him in his final months still content in Wallace's company, still devoted, still certain he had chosen correctly. Whether Wallace felt the same is a quieter, more complicated question. But here is something I do know. The brother who ended up with the crown, the one Edward left behind when he walked out of Fort Belvedere in December 1936, that man became by nearly universal historical consensus one of the finest monarchs Britain ever had. Not because he was the most brilliant, not because he was the most charismatic, but because he understood in the deepest possible way what duty requires of a person. George VI is a story of a different kind of love entirely, and that is exactly where we go from here. Picture this scene, the evening of December 10th, 1936. The document of abdication has just been signed at Fort Belvedere. Edward is preparing to leave England, and somewhere else in London a man named Albert, known to his family as Bertie, has just understood that the unthinkable has happened, that the crown that was never supposed to be his is now irrevocably his. By multiple accounts he wept, not because he was weak, not because he was sentimental, but because he had spent his entire adult life knowing with total clarity exactly what kingship demanded of a person. and he understood with equal clarity that he was about to carry that weight for the rest of his life. Ready or not, stammer or not, prepared or not, he was 41 years old. He had never been trained to be king. He had spent decades existing in the cheerful social shorthand of the time as the spare, the backup, quiet second son who gave speeches at industrial exhibitions and planted trees at public ceremonies, while his brilliant, dazzling, impossible brother took up all the oxygen in every room. And now, brother was gone, and the world was watching. What happened next is, in my view, one of the more genuinely moving stories that the abdication crisis produced. Not because it is romantic, but because it is about something far less fashionable than romance. It is about what happens when someone chooses duty not because it is glamorous, but because they understand deeply and personally that if they do not carry it, no one else will. To understand George VI, you have to understand what he was carrying before the crown even arrived. He was born on the 14th of December 1895, a date already heavy with royal symbolism, being the anniversary of the death of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's beloved husband. His grandmother, Queen Victoria, noted in her diary that the timing was a little touching. His family nicknamed him Bertie, and the nickname stuck because it was gentle and informal in a way that his life mostly wasn't. He had knock-knees as a child. He was forced to wear corrective splints at night to straighten his legs. He was naturally left-handed and was made to write with his right hand at practice, then considered essential for a proper education, and which researchers now believe may have contributed directly to the stammer that would define his public life for decades. The stammer began when he was about 7 or 8 years old, whether it was caused by the left-handedness correction, by the emotional coldness of his upbringing, by his father's famously intimidating manner, or by some combination of all three, is a question historians and speech therapists have argued about ever since. What is not disputed is that it was severe, that it made every public appearance an ordeal, that his siblings were by various accounts allowed to tease him about it, that his father George V, not a gentle man by temperament, would sometimes berate him about the stammer in front of others. When he stood up at Wembley Stadium in October of 1925 to give the closing speech at the British Empire exhibition in front of tens of thousands of people, the experience was, in the words of historians, an ordeal for both speaker and listeners. There were long, agonized pauses. The words came haltingly, fitfully. By the end, the crowd applauded not in triumph, but in sympathy, which is the more generous kind of respect and also the harder one to receive. He tried multiple speech therapists before that day. None of them had helped in any lasting way. 1926, a full decade before the abdication forced him onto the throne, Bertie's wife Elizabeth persuaded him to try one more time. The therapist she found was an Australian named Lionel Logue, who had set up a practice on Harley Street the same year. Logue was not formally credentialed in the academic way. He was self-taught and conventional, and almost immediately dismissed by the medical establishment as a quack. It also happened that by all available evidence, the only person who ever actually helped Bertie speak. Logue's diagnosis was technical. He believed the Duke had poor coordination between his voice box and his diaphragm, creating tension-induced muscle spasms that block the flow of speech. His treatment was a daily regimen of vocal exercises, breathing patterns, resonance work, tongue placement. He also did something the medical establishment considered somewhat improper. He insisted on treating Bertie like a person rather than a patient, and used informal language. He encouraged the Duke to talk about what was actually frightening him, rather than simply working on the mechanics of speech. What followed was, by the available records, remarkable. Logue and Bertie met for 82 appointments over 14 months. The Duke wrote to Logue from a ship heading to Australia in 1927. you remember my fear of speaking those particular words, and give it every evening at dinner on board, this does not worry me anymore. When he arrived in Australia to open the new Parliament House in Canberra, he gave speech after speech during the journey, and observers described him as speaking resonantly and without stammering. 24 years of a debilitating impediment, 14 months of work with the right person, and it was gone. Not entirely, it never entirely disappeared, and under extreme stress it sometimes reassert itself. But gone enough to change a life, Lowe would remain at Bertie's side off and on for the next quarter century. He was invited to the royal family's Christmas dinner parties to help prepare for the Christmas broadcasts. He was present in the broadcasting room for the most important speech of George VI's reign. They were by the end genuine friends, but I find myself thinking what a thing to be for a man who became a king. An Australian speech therapist from Harley Street called you Bertie. Sessions have told you that you were braver than you believe. When the application fell on December 10, 1936, Bertie became King George VI overnight. They chose the name George specifically a deliberate signal to the country that he intended continuity with his father's reign and stability, rather than disruption after the chaos of the preceding year. The symbolism was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. He was by his own admission overwhelmed. There is a well-documented account of him visiting his mother, Queen Mary, on the day of the abdication, and breaking down in tears in the sitting room. He told her he had never wanted the crown. He had not been trained for it. He did not know how to be king. Queen Mary was by all accounts a woman of extraordinary emotional restraint, and proudly held him, and said something to the effect that there was no one better suited to do what duty required. Whether she believed that entirely we cannot know, but what we do know is that the man who sat weeping in his mother's sitting room on the 10th of December 1936 became over the 15 years that followed one of the most respected monarchs in British history. Not through charisma, not through brilliance, but through showing up relentlessly without complaints to do the work that he was doing. The defining test came 3 years later. On the 3rd of September 1939, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain went on the radio at 11:15 in the morning to announce that Britain was now at war with Germany. At 6 o'clock that evening, King George VI addressed the nation. Lionel Lowe was in the room. He began, "In this grave hour, perhaps the most dreadful in our history, I send to every household of my peoples, both at home and overseas, this message spoken with the same depth of feeling for each one of you, as if I were able to cross your threshold and speak to you myself." He stumbled briefly on certain words, as he always did. He spoke. He addressed not just Britain, but the entire Commonwealth, hundreds of millions of people across dozens of countries, in a voice that was steady and human and real. Lowe wrote in his diary that night, it was really magnificent. It was not fulsome praise from a court flatterer. Lowe had spent 13 years helping this man find his voice. He knew exactly what it would cost. When the speech ended after Lowe had left the room, the king reportedly turned to him and said, "Lowe, however, this turns out, don't know how to thank you for what you've done." Lowe, with the absolute self-assurance of a man who had never been intimidated by royalty, apparently replied, "You did it yourself." Over the next 6 years, George VI and Queen Elizabeth did something that changed the relationship between the monarchy and the British public permanently. They stayed. In September of 1945, German bombs fell on Buckingham Palace. The King and Queen were both present when the attack happened. The Royal Chapel was destroyed. The inner quadrangle was hit. Debris scattered across the grounds. Neither George nor Elizabeth was harmed. They had been in the building when it shook under the impact. The government urged them then and repeatedly throughout the Blitz to leave London, to go to the country, to keep themselves safe. They refused. After that first direct attack on the palace, Queen Elizabeth made a statement that has become one of the most quoted lines of the entire war. She said she was glad they had been bombed, because now she said she felt she could look the East End in the face. Think about what that means. The poorest districts of London, the East End, had been suffering devastating bombing raids for weeks. Working class families had lost their homes, their streets, their neighbours, and the Queen's response to Buckingham Palace being hit was not relief that she had survived or anger at the attackers. It was relief that they had now shared something of what ordinary Londoners had been enduring. That the palace had taken a bomb, and they had stayed inside it. Now they had earned the right to look those people in the eye. That is an extraordinary statement from any public figure. Coming from a queen in the middle of a war, it was galvanizing. They made visit after visit to bombed neighborhoods throughout the war years. They walked through rubble. They shook hands with people who had lost everything. They stood in factory lines and military training grounds and naval shipyards. They rationed food along with everyone else. When the EastEnders famously shouted, "Good old Bertie." At the King, on one of these visits, something had clearly shifted in how Britain felt about its monarchy. Adolf Hitler, following the reports of Queen Elizabeth's wartime conduct, reportedly called her the most dangerous woman in Europe. That is in its way rather high praise. Here is the thing about George VI that history sometimes forgets in the rush to celebrate him. He was paying an enormous personal price. He was a heavy smoker, had been since his youth, in the way that many men of his generation were, the way that cigarettes were then understood to be relaxing rather than beautiful. The stress of the war, the sleepless nights, the unending responsibility of being the symbolic center of a nation under siege, all of it led the habit wore down his health in ways that would not become fully apparent until several years after the war ended. In 1949, he was diagnosed with arterial disease in his right leg. He underwent surgery. The leg recovered, but the underlying condition was not going away. In September of 1951, his doctors, keeping the most alarming details from both him and the public, he had his entire left lung removed. The official announcement described the procedure as structural abnormalities. What it actually was, as medical historians have since confirmed, was total pneumonectomy, carcinoma, lung cancer. Did not tell him. They kept the word cancer entirely out of the official indications. He was 55 years old. He'd been king for 50 years, having been handed a broken institution, and spent more than a decade rebuilding under conditions nobody could have predicted or prepared for. On the 31st of January 1952, he stood at London Airport with a goodbye to his daughter, Princess Elizabeth. Departing on a Commonwealth tour that his poor health had made him unable to undertake himself. He was thin and pale, and the photographs from that morning showed a man who looks very plainly ill. 8 days later, on the 6th of February, I brought a cup of cocoa to his room at Sandringham House at 11 o'clock at night. The king was in bed reading a magazine about the countryside and field sports he loved. He looked comfortable. He said good night. He was found dead the next morning. Coronary thrombosis in his sleep. He was 56 years old. His daughter learned of his death in Kenya. She had been staying overnight at the Treetops Hotel watching elephants in the waterhole when the news arrived. She had gone out as a princess. She returned to England as queen. George VI had been king for 15 years, 308 days. He had never expected to be king at all. He had been given the throne by a brother who couldn't bear the weight of it, and he had carried it stammer, bad leg, damaged lung and all, until there was nothing left to carry it with. I want to end this part with something personal because I think about George VI sometimes in a specific way, not as a king, but as a person who was handed something he didn't ask for and who simply got on with it.
We gotta
He
get
didn't have
together
the
every day.
luxury of choosing between the duty.
Gotta work
The
with.
duty arrived before anyone asked his preference.
We're not living together
The
and
work
not
for
doing anything.
years was to the obscurity to fix a speech
We dating.
problem. Not because anyone required it, but because he was trying to prepare himself for a role he hoped would never actually fall to him. And when it did fall to him anyway, he was ready. There is a line from Logue's notes on one of their sessions from the early years when Bertie was still about his patient. He has such perseverance. He is the bravest man I know. Not the most charismatic, not the most prepared, the bravest. Because it takes a different kind of bravery to do the quiet, unsexy, unglamorous work, incapable of what you might be called to do. No spotlight, no abdication speech, no love story for the ages. Just a man and his speech therapist meeting for session after session in a Harley Street office building, something that might never even be needed, and then be needed. History remembers Edward VIII for the choice he made in December 1936. It remembers George VI for what he chose to do with the consequences of his brother's choice for the rest of his life. One of them is remembered as a romantic, the other is remembered as a great king. I'll leave it to you to decide which kind of legacy feels more worth having, and yet the story of this abdication is not finished. There is still the question of what it all did to the monarchy itself, what it left behind. The cracks it opened that are still visible today if you know where to look, that is exactly where we go next. Scandals have a half-life. Some burn bright for a season and fade into footnotes. Others leave something behind a fault line in the rock invisible on the surface, shaping everything that grows above it for generations. The abdication of 1936 was the second kind. 8 decades on its echoes are still audible in almost every major crisis the British monarchy faces since then. Not as a direct cause always, but as a shadow, a requiem, a cautionary tale told in whispers behind closed palace doors, whenever someone inside the institution starts behaving in a way that sounds uncomfortably familiar. This is the part of the story that tends to get overlooked when people tell it as a love story. Because love stories end, but institutions carry their traumas forward. And the trauma of 1936 shaped the British royal family in ways that are still visible if you know where to look. Start with what the abdication actually did to the institution in the ability, because the picture is more complicated than most people realise. On the surface, the monarchy recovered quickly. George VI stepped up, won the war, won the public. By 1945, he was probably the most beloved British king since Victoria. The institution had survived. You could argue, as many historians do, that the abdication ended up strengthening the monarchy in the long run by removing a king whose political leanings and personal recklessness would have caused far more serious damage than one constitutional crisis. But beneath that recovery, ISIS implanted something that would take decades to fully understand. Here is the first thing implanted: a profound, almost pathological institutional fear of personal desire. After 1936, the unspoken rule inside the British royal family, especially among those closest to the sovereign, was that personal happiness was a luxury you could not afford to let go of empty. The institution had nearly been destroyed by one man who chose what he wanted over what he owed. That lesson was absorbed. It was absorbed deeply. It was absorbed in ways that sometimes made the family less human, not more dignified. The clearest early example of this came just 17 years after the abdication. Not quite a generation. The wound was still fresh. At Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in June of 1953, a ceremony meant to represent a new chapter, the beginning young queen and a renewed monarchy. Something happened that nobody planned for. At some point during the celebrations, Princess Margaret was photographed taking a piece of lint from the uniform of a man named William Captain Peter Townsend. It was a tiny, intimate gesture, kind of made without thinking that someone you know very well. The photographs caused an immediate sensation, because the public looking at those photographs can see something else trying to keep quiet in front. Princess Margaret, the Queen's younger sister, was in love with Peter Townsend, but Peter Townsend was divorced. Townsend was by every account an extraordinarily admirable man. He had been a Royal Air Force pilot and war hero during the Battle of Britain. He had served as an equerry, a personal aide to King George VI, who reportedly considered him one of the finest men he knew. He was handsome, intelligent, kind. His divorce had come about after his wife left him. He was in every respect except one a perfectly suitable companion for a princess. The one exception was the only one that mattered to the institution. He had been divorced, and a former spouse was still living. The shadow of 1936 fell across that romance immediately, heavily and repeatedly. The British government, the cabinet, the Church of England, none of them needed a long meeting to reach their verdict. They were not going to remove the application crisis. Not 17 years later, not everyone could avoid it. Parliament made its position clear. The Church of England made its position clear. Queen Elizabeth II, barely a year into her reign, 27 years old, desperately aware of what her father's health had cost him, what the abdication had cost her, family found herself having to act as the barrier between her sister's happiness and the requirements of the institution she had just inherited. She asked Margaret to wait a year before making any decisions. Margaret waited. When the year was up, the political situation had not improved. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, who was himself somewhat awkward, divorced man, made clear that Parliament would not approve the marriage. The most that was offered was a compromise. Margaret could marry Townsend if she agreed to renounce all her rights of succession, and those of any children she might have, and effectively remove herself from royal life for a period. Margaret deliberated for weeks. On the 31st of October 1955, she issued a statement. She would not be marrying Group Captain Peter Townsend. She was 25 years old. A royal historian reviewing this period later called the Townsend affair the most direct and painful echo of the abdication that the family had faced. Same question, same answer, same cost. The difference was that Margaret paid it herself without being forced into it. Whether that made it more dignified or simply more painful is a question I leave to you. She eventually married a photographer named Anthony Armstrong Jones, who became Lord Snowdon. The marriage lasted 18 years and produced 2 children. Then it ended in divorce, making Margaret, by a particular twist of historical irony, the first senior member of the royal family to divorce in 77 years. She could not marry a divorced man, but she was free to become one. Now here is the thing about institutional memory. It is not infinite. It does not stay equally powerful forever. It fades generation by generation in direct proportion to how much the world outside the institution has changed. By 1992, the year Queen Elizabeth II called her Annus Horribilis, the year of horrors. The world outside Buckingham Palace looked very different from the world of 1936. 3 of the Queen's 4 children had their marriages break down in that same year. The divorce rate in Britain had risen dramatically. Public attitudes toward divorce had shifted almost unrecognisably in 2 generations. And yet the monarchy was still operating in important respects as though the rules of 1936 still applied, as though divorced people were still inherently unsuitable, as though personal unhappiness was still a private matter to be managed invisibly, rather than acknowledged openly. The consequences of this gap between institutional rules and lived reality were catastrophic, and they had a name: Diana. I am not going to tell the full story of Diana here. She deserves her own telling. We will get to her. But in the context of 1936 and its shadow, one thing is worth saying clearly. The catastrophic collapse of the marriage of Charles and Diana, the years of public misery, the leaked interviews, the mutual humiliations, the death that finally ended it, Paris Tunnel in August of 1997, was in significant part a consequence of a system that had never learned to honestly acknowledge the human cost of what it required. Charles had been in love with Camilla Parker Bowles for years before he married Diana. Alice had discouraged that relationship. Charles was pressed into a marriage he did not want with a woman who did not know the reality of what she was entering. The institution needed an heir. It needed one produced by a conventional marriage. It needed this done before too much more time passed. The ghost of 1936, the idea that personal desire was dangerous, that it had to be subordinated to institutional necessity, hovered over every decision. The result was not stability. The result was 3 people's lives in ruins, and a wave of public grief at Diana's death that shook the monarchy, its foundations more thoroughly than almost anything since the abdication itself. And then, and here is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, something began to shift. After Diana, the palace could no longer pretend that suppressing personal desire automatically served the institution. The evidence was too overwhelming, public emotion too raw, the lesson too clear. Charles eventually married Camilla Parker Bowles in April of 2005, a divorced woman, in a civil ceremony because the Church of England would not fulfill the service. Queen Elizabeth II declined to attend a gesture that acknowledged the tension without resolving it, but she gave her formal consent. Camilla became the Duchess of Cornwall. Think about what had changed between 1936 and 2005. In 1936, a king was forced off the throne rather than marry a divorced American woman. 69 years later, the heir to that same throne married a divorced English woman, and the monarchy survived. The Church of England did not collapse. The Commonwealth did not dissolve. 3 of the Queen's 4 children had now been divorced, either remarried or were in long-term relationships outside their marriages. The country continued, and then Prince Harry married Meghan Markle in 2018, a divorced American woman. The parallel is almost too obvious to be comfortable, but it is real, and it is striking. In 1936, the most powerful institutions in Britain, the government, the church, the Commonwealth, united to prevent a king from marrying a divorced American woman. In 2018, the Archbishop of Canterbury officiated at the wedding of a senior member of the royal family to a divorced American woman in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, with the full blessing of the Queen, live on television, watched by approximately 30 million people in Britain alone. That is a measurement of how much the world changed between those 2 moments, of how thoroughly the prohibitions that seemed immovable in 1936 had dissolved by the time the next generation made similar choices. Does that mean the abdication crisis was simply a product of its time, a moral panic that would have faded on its own? And Edward and Wallace were simply unlucky in their timing? Or does it mean that the institution was right in 1936 and has been slowly losing its authority and distinctiveness ever since? That is a genuine, tested question among historians, and I want to be honest about that because both sides have real arguments. One more echo that I think is the most direct and the most unsettling. In 2020, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stepped back from their roles as CEO. They cited, among other things, the relentless media pressure, the institutional failure to protect Meghan, what they described as racism, fundamental institute. They moved to California. He gave interviews, gave a great deal of interview, actually. Now, I am not going to tell you that Harry and Meghan were right or wrong about everything they said or did. That is not a judgment to make. It is still too recent and too raw for any honest historical verdict. But the structural parallel to 1936 is impossible to ignore. A senior member of the royal family choosing a life outside the institution, not a life inside it, and all seen by significant parts of the British establishment as unsuitable American, divorced mixed race, outspoken, in a media environment that covered her in ways that Palestine to challenge, and ultimately a departure and an exile that, whatever you think of the specific details, raised the same fundamental question that the abdication had raised 84 years earlier. What does the monarchy owe the people inside it? What do those people owe the monarchy in return? The answers to those questions have changed enormously between 1936 and 2020, but the questions themselves have not changed at all. A Labour Member of Parliament named George Hardie stood up in the House of Commons on the 11th of December 1936, the day of the abdication, and said something that the institution must have found deeply uncomfortable. He said the crisis had done more for republicanism than 50 years of propaganda could do. He was not entirely wrong. Support for the monarchy dipped sharply in the weeks and months after the abdication. Republican sentiment, which had been a fringe position for decades, briefly became something people discussed as a serious possibility. The Labour Party politician quoted at the same time said it more bluntly. The abdication proved that the monarchy was an institution run by and for a small elite capable of destroying a man publicly when it suited their purposes. What actually happened, of course, was that the monarchy did not fall. Adapted. George VI built it. Queen Elizabeth II spent 70 years consolidating it. The institution proved more durable than its worst version suggested. But Hardie's warning contained the truth that the palace has had to rediscover roughly once per generation. Ever since the monarchy's survival depends not on rules, but on relevance. Not on prohibitions, but on being seen to reflect the values of the people it represents. Those values are not static, change. Institutions that do not change with them eventually find themselves defending a fortress that nobody is trying to attack simply because nobody cares enough to bother. The abdication of 1936 was ultimately one episode in a much longer story about that negotiation. Negotiation between the ancient institution and the modern world, between the permanent requirements of office and the temporary but urgent demands of being human. That negotiation is not over. It has not been over for a single day since the 11th of December 1936. And the next chapter of that story, the one that brought it to the widest possible public audience, the one that made the whole painful debate global, begins with a woman in a white dress walking down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral in July of 1981, smiling at a man she barely knew, while the whole world watched and called it a fairy tale. You know how that story ended. It starts right here. There is a photograph taken on the 24th of February 1981, the day the world first learned that the heir to the British throne was engaged to be married. A young woman stands beside Prince Charles outside Buckingham Palace, which is wearing a blue wool suit and a smile so wide it seems slightly uncertain when smiles look, when you're not quite sure what you've walked into. He is 19 years old. He is 32. When a reporter asked whether they were in love, she said, "Of course," immediately without hesitation. Charles looked at the reporter, paused and Whatever in love means. All words. Spoken on the happiest day in theory of both their lives, broadcast to millions of people waiting to celebrate with them. And in those 4 words, if you were listening carefully, was the entire story of what was about to happen. Let me tell you who Diana Spencer was before Alice got hold of her, because I think that part of the story gets lost. She was born on the 1st of July 1961, third daughter of Viscount Althorpe at Park House on the Sandringham estate, the very estate belonging to the royal family. The family had served the crown for generations. The grandmothers had both been ladies-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. In that sense, she was not an outsider at all. She was someone who had grown up in the shadow of the palace, literally and figuratively. Her childhood was not easy. The parents' marriage was miserable and ended in divorce when she was 6, a process that involved a custody battle so bitter it became a court case. Her mother left. Her father won custody. She described the sound of gravel on the driveway the day her mother drove away as one of the defining sounds of her childhood. She was by most accounts a warm, slightly shy girl who was not academically gifted, who loved children and dancing, and who failed her O-level examinations twice. When Charles proposed to her in early 1981, she was working as a nursery school teacher's assistant in London, sharing a flat with several friends at a modest wage. She was 19 years old. They had met in a meaningful way roughly 13 times. 13 times. Not 13 months of courtship. 13 actual encounters. And then a marriage proposal. But here is what made the palace want her. She was aristocratic good blood, as they put it. She was young and therefore in the institutional calculation pliable. She was, as Vanity Fair's reporting later described it, assessed at Balmoral during a sort of informal audition, after which the family decided she had the valuable qualities necessary for a future queen. She was crucially a virgin. This was actually considered important, quietly verified. And she was by every outward sign unformed enough that she could be shaped into whatever the institution needed her to be. That was the plan. As plans go, it was not a particularly admirable one. It was the plan. What the institution failed to account for was that Diana was not in fact malleable. She was underneath the shyness and the uncertain smile, a person of extraordinary emotional intelligence and fierce inner life, who had no interest whatsoever in being shaped into someone else's idea of what it should be. The wedding itself was by any external measure one of the great spectacle of the 20th century. 29th of July 1981, Paul's Cathedral, London, 3,500 guests inside, 600,000 people lining the streets outside, 750 million television viewers in 74 countries, watching on screens around the world. Recently discovered that Charles had ordered a gold bracelet for Camilla Parker Bowles, his former girlfriend, with whom she already suspected he was still deeply involved, as a gift days before their wedding. She had heard the two of them on the telephone, Charles's study, speaking with an intimacy that told her everything she needed to know. Her dress fittings told another story too. When the Emmanuel team first began measuring her for the gown, her waist was between 26 and 27 inches. By the wedding day in July, it had shrunk to 23, not because she was dieting, but because she had begun to struggle with bulimia, an eating disorder that would consume nearly a decade of her life, that she later described as a secret disease, a way of trying to make something controllable, a world that felt completely out of control. She wanted to call off the wedding. She later said she told her sisters this the morning of the ceremony. They replied gently that it was too late, the commemorative tea towels were already printed. She laughed. Then she got into the carriage. What followed for those inside the palace was a slow-motion catastrophe. For the public watching from outside, it looked like a fairy tale for nearly a decade. The gap between those two realities is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something important about the architecture of illusion that a monarchy requires to function. Publicly, Diana was a sensation from the moment she stepped out. The press called it Diana Mania. On their first major overseas tour together in 1983, visiting Australia and New Zealand, the crowds were so enormous and so specifically focused on her that Charles was reported to have complained to an aide. When the royal party split to cover more ground, the disappointed crowds at Charles's side would ask when Diana was coming. He was the Prince of Wales. He had trained for this his entire life. She'd been doing it for 2 years. She connected with people in a way the royal family had not seen before. Not the formal, gloved, measured connection of traditional royal visits, but something more direct, more physical, more instinctively human. She touched people. She held the hands of patients in hospitals. She sat on the beds of children with serious illnesses and talked to them as though she was actually there, not performing. In 1987, she shook the ungloved hand of an AIDS patient at a time when many people were afraid to touch someone with a disease at all. One photograph, one gesture, and the entire public conversation about AIDS shifted. She was, in other words, exactly what the monarchy did. She was modernizing it, humanizing it, giving it warmth and emotional accessibility. She was the institution's greatest asset, and privately she was dissolving. 12 years between the wedding in 1981 and the formal separation announcement in December 1992 contained a private history that the public would not fully understand until much later, when Diana began telling it herself. She described in recordings made secretly by biographer Andrew Morton, recordings that were not published until after her death, a life of extraordinary isolation inside one of the most gilded addresses in the world. Charles was frequently away or absorbed in his own world, and in his presence the emotional distance between them was profound. She described going to him during her first pregnancy, telling him she was suffering from postnatal depression and physical and emotional pain. He told her she was crying more than went riding. January of 1982, 12 weeks into her first pregnancy, she threw herself down the staircase at Sandringham. She was not harmed. The pregnancy survived. He later said she had done it deliberately out of desperation. She did not know how else to express. It was not she made clear a moment she was proud of. It was a moment she was simply honest and documented. By her own account, she attempted to harm herself multiple times in the early years of her marriage, not because she was, as the royal family initially characterized it, unstable either, but because she was a young woman, trapped in a role she had not been prepared for, a marriage she had not chosen to lead, and an institution that had no vocabulary for what she was going through. He said in those secret recordings, "Maybe I was the first person ever to be in this family who ever had a depression, or was ever overheated." Stop and think about that sentence. She was not the first person in that family to suffer. She could possibly be. She was possibly the first person to name it, the first person to refuse to perform roles when she was not well. And the institution trained over centuries to manage illness above all else had absolutely no idea what to do with her. published. It was intimate and emotional. It gave the world of Diana its raw, nothing like the poised figure in the photographs. November of 1993. Private telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, also recorded in 1989 when Charles was still married, was published. It was far more damaging. It made it impossible for anyone to deny the obvious. December of 1992. Prime Minister John Major stood up in Parliament and announced the formal separation of the Prince and Princess of Wales. Then November 20th, 1895. The most significant royal broadcast since Edward VIII's vacation speech, nearly 60 years earlier. Diana sat in his sitting room at Kensington Palace, fluttering a journalist named Martin Bashir, front of a camera crew who had been smuggled into the palace. He appeared to have seen me in Buckingham Palace to the dared. She wore a dark suit. Her eye makeup was heavier than usual delivery. Though she said later that she wanted to look strong, not fragile. For 55 minutes she told the truth. She understood it. She talked about bulimia. She talked about the depression. She talked about the self-harm. She talked about Camilla saying a sentence that entered the language permanently. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. He was asked whether she thought she would ever be queen. She said she thought it was unlikely. She said she wanted to be in her own ways. Queen was hearts. Phrase that became both her greatest statement and for the institution the most threatening one. 23 million people would have watched that broadcast. The BBC received more calls immediately after than for any programme in its history. The next morning, Queen Elizabeth II wrote personally to both Charles and Diana, recommending the divorce quickly. The decree was made absolute in August of 1996. The next year, Diana was free. Freer, more famous than ever and doing the work, became a genuine purpose, campaigning for the banning of landmines, visiting hospitals and refugee camps, using her visibility for causes the world might otherwise not notice. She seemed for the first time to be living a life of her own choosing. Then, the 31st of August 1997, she was 36 years old. She was in Paris with Dodi Fayed, the son of Egyptian billionaire Mohammed Fayed. Just after midnight, they left the Ritz Hotel through a back entrance in a black Mercedes, trying to evade the photographers who followed her everywhere. The driver, Henry Hall, was travelling at more than 60 miles per hour in a tunnel with a 30-mile-per-hour limit. In the corner along the tunnel, the car struck a concrete pillar and crashed. Diana was taken to the Pitié Salpêtrière Hospital. She was 36 years old and in good health. The injuries were internal. Surgeons worked for hours. At 4 in the morning, Paris time, she died. In London, people began leaving flowers outside Buckingham Palace within an hour of the news. By morning, the banks of flowers were waist high. By the following day, they stretched for hundreds of yards in every direction. Not formal flower arrangements, just flowers, ordinary bunches of them, ordinary people who had driven or walked to be there and needed to put something down. Buckingham Palace, on the day the nation's most beloved public figure died, with no flag at half-mast, because the sovereign was not in residence, because protocol said the flag was only flown at all when the Queen was there, and the Queen was at Balmoral in Scotland with her grandsons in private grief. The palace remained silent 5 days. The Sun tabloid, not typically a publication you would expect to lead a constitutional crisis, published a front page that asked in the largest typeface it could print, "Where is our Queen? Where is our flag?" A quarter of Britons in polling conducted that week called for the abolition of the monarchy. I want you to think about that number. 1 in 4. A small protest movement. 1 in 4 people in Britain in the week of Diana's death were willing to say say that they were done with the institution. The monarchy, which had survived the abdication of Edward VIII, had survived 2 world wars, had survived the entire dismantling of the British Empire, was looking at the first week of September 1997, at the very real possibility of being destroyed by its own silence. On September the 5th, the Queen returned to London. He visited the flowers outside the palace, with Prince Philip walking slowly along the crowd. She was applauded, genuine, renewed applause, not the ceremonial kind. That evening she spoke to the nation from Buckingham Palace. She called Diana an exceptional Diana's public passed Buckingham Palace during the funeral procession. The Queen that does not bow to anyone but whom the entire world bows over their head. On the streets of London, 2.5 billion watched on television worldwide. Inside Westminster Abbey, Elton John performed a reworked version of the song Campbell. Dedicated to Diana title Revive Each Rose. The single that followed sold 33 million copies. Best-selling single since charts were first compiled. Here is the thing I keep returning to thinking about all of this. Diana did not set out to challenge the monarchy. She set out to survive it. She set out to find some way to be herself within a system that had been designed almost architecturally to prevent the people deciding on being themselves. She failed at that in the sense that the marriage collapsed and the institution turned cold. But in failing, she found something the institution had not anticipated. She found the public. She found that her honesty, her willingness to say, I suffer, and here is how, and here is why, resonated with people in a way that royal dignity never could. She did not destroy the monarchy. Anything, the extraordinary grief at her death demonstrated just how much people still believed in something the monarchy was supposed to represent. They were grieving not just Diana, the idea of a royal family that could be warm and human, genuinely connected to the lives of ordinary people. They were grieving a version of the institution that had briefly probably seemed possible. The institution that Diana came from had its roots in 1936 in an abdication that said personal desire must always yield to institutional necessity. Diana spent her entire adult life pushing back against that. Not with politics or argument, but simply by being unwilling to perform happiness she did not feel. And in the end, 23 million people watched her say so live on television, whatever in love means indeed. There is one more story from this period that belongs here, and it is short, and I find it quietly extraordinary. After Diana's death, a team of advisors at Buckingham Palace was assembled to understand what had gone so wrong. One of the things they decided in the aftermath of that catastrophic week of silence was that the palace needed a website. An actual website, a place where ordinary people could feel some connection.
Oh, I know.
An institution that had always kept them distant.
Probably the year.
First night of the chose to broadcast publicly online as a demonstration of the new opening was the knighthood of Elton John.
Oh, really?
The man who had just sung Goodbye England's Rose at Diana's funeral, watched by 2.5 million people, was given a knighthood, and the palace broadcast it as an act of connection to modern Britain. I will leave you to decide what you make of that particular piece of institutional self-awareness. What happened next in the years that followed Diana's death was a monarchy that had learned painfully that it could not continue treating human beings like instruments of continuity. It began very slowly and not always gracefully to modernize, to open up, to acknowledge that the public was not simply watching the institution, but that the institution existed in some meaningful sense because of the public. The public withdrew its belief. No amount of protocol or procedure or ancient tradition would hold them together. The lessons of 1936 had not been learned the first time. They had not been fully learned the second time either. In each crisis, Edward, Margaret, Charles, and Diana, in September 1997, added something to the institution's understanding of its own fragility. The story of whether those lessons have finally been learned. The question of what it means to be a royal family in the 21st century, and what the institution owes the people inside it, what it owes the public outside it, is not finished yet. And the next chapter of that story begins perhaps unexpectedly, not in the secret files of intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic, and in a set of documents that took decades to surface, and even longer to understand what they meant. Because it turns out that the story of NDA, the man at the bottom, is the application that started the chain, has secrets in it that the official history left out. And some of those secrets are stranger, more unsettling than any we've covered so far. Picture this. London, 1836, Holland. A man in a dark oak crouched near a telephone junction opposite the Prague, one of the city's oldest and most elegant public spaces right beside Buckingham Palace. He was not a victim, and he was not lost. In one of the scale intelligence policies, a man named Thomas Robinson learned to know his life being far. What he's doing tonight is located the precise tap that his government can listen to the private telephone conversations without backing a budget. The intelligence officer dispatched by the Prime Minister, authorized by the Home Secretary, vouching in a public plant and who sees recognized Americans and constitutional terms the head of state, commander-in-chief, governor of the Church of England. British government is a controversial policy where it is not to set the royal conditions except that in 1936 some family and the other cabinet former Royal Air Force pilot, now working as a salesman for the Ford Motor Company. The Special Branch report dated 3rd of July 1935 described him as a very charming adventurer, very good-looking, well-bred, excellent dancer. It added that the particular tone of disapproval of his intelligence report seemed to reserve for men who are better looking than the people writing about him, that he is said to boast that every woman falls for him. According to the police files, Trundle and Wallace were conducting a secret affair. They met openly at social gatherings. They met privately by appointment at his flat in Mayfair. She was giving him an expensive present. He was, in the language of the report, making intimate relations. While Edward, Prince of Wales, was giving up his throne for the woman I love, while he was negotiating with prime ministers and archbishops and Commonwealth governors over the question of whether he could keep both the crown and Wallace was apparently also keeping another relationship entirely separate and highly secret. And here is the layer underneath that layer, one I find genuinely difficult to account for clearly. Trundle kept his affair with Wallace a secret from everyone, his friends, his family, and even his closest wartime comrades, until the day he died in 1958. He never thought a word of it. His friends, when interviewed decades later, refused to believe it. One of his old Air Force companions told reporters, "Knowing Guy as I did, I simply refused to believe he entered into an affair with Wallace Simpson for its own sake." The implication being that perhaps Trundle was not really a lover but an asset. Someone in intelligence services had placed in England forced Wallace to keep an eye on her. Whether that is true, we cannot say with certainty. Files do not explicitly state it. It is a question that has never been fully answered, and it says something important about how the intelligence world works. Sometimes the most compromising document is the one that does not explain itself. When Edward became king in January of 1936, his operation escalated dramatically. Now it was no longer just a matter of monitoring and embarrassing threats. Now the government was watching the head of state. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin personally authorized the MI5 to tap the king's telephone lines, the lines running in and out of the Buckingham Palace for 30 days. The head of MI5, Vernon Kell, had initial reservations. The worry it was a political matter rather than a general security concern, and that the security service should not be recognized for political purposes. For more precisely, the distinction perhaps less sound. The files MI5 gathered during this operation included one of the most remarkable pieces of recording in the history of British intelligence. On the top of the weekend of December 1936, when a clearly anguished King Edward sat alone at Buckingham Palace, he telephoned his brother Vernon to tell him he had made his decision. He could not continue as king if it meant giving up Wallace. Rome, that is. Their private, intimate, devastating conversation was heard by a third party, the intelligence officer assigned to the attack. This was as one historian later noted trying. Ronald would argue that the Queen stopped being a monarchy and began to practice a modern surveillance state. When the government listened, the dominated policy of the crown was managing it. The operation on Wallace did not stop the reputation. It did not stop the next day. It did not stop when the couple married in France in June 1937. It did not stop when they sailed to the Bahamas in August 1940. At this point, surveillance expanded to include the American Federal Bureau of Investigation, operating under the personal direction of J. Edgar Hoover, where his own particular interest in their connection.
gonna have to move it over.
Armed security services in the Western world were often not just an embarrassing way. What the intelligence services suspected in the time and what was later partially confirmed out into a relationship between the Windsors, Nazi Germany went considerably beyond naive admiration for what the Germans had achieved. The question was always how deep that relationship ran, and what exactly either party had done or offered to do. Those are questions that declassified files have illuminated without ever quite resolving. And then in May of 1945, the most extraordinary chapter of this entire story fell quite literally off the back of a truck. The war was ending. Germany was collapsing. A young soldier named David Silberberg, first lieutenant in the counterintelligence section of the United States Army, born in Germany himself, who had fled the Nazis with his family in 1936, was traveling through the Harz Mountains, the region where he had grown up. He noticed something unusual. A military truck lying in a ditch at the side of the road near a town called the Gennershaus, with papers scattered across the ground around it. One up. The look at the signature at the bottom of the document recognized the name of Lucky on the Neutron. Origins of Nazi Germany. Then went back into the States. He found that someone had intended to destroy a vast collection of archival materials, more than 400 tons of documents from the Nazi bomb industry, had partially failed. The man named Von Lusch very most of them had calculated that they might be used towards personal leverage, and hence later tried to make them. Documents were exhumed and transported to Marlow-class contamination. Among 400 tons, historians found roughly 6 material that stolen, double runners, the contents of what became known as the file of the Marlow files, private Germany. Telegraph and relationship between Nazi Germany, more active and more troubling than voyage. Telegraph discussed his attitudes toward the war, which reported that Germany would be brought to negotiate its elections. German officials joined the Nazis and spent in Spain, Portugal, summer of 1940. On Telegraph quoted Churchill, by that point in the final years of his life, volume history of the Second World War. The Duke of Windsor appeared in it briefly and carefully as a peripheral figure. The files that had caused Churchill to write a personal letter to Eisenhower were not mentioned. Let me step back from the specific documents for a moment and ask the larger question, because I think it is worth sitting with. What does it mean morally, not just technically, when a government conducts secret surveillance on its own head of state? When it opens his letters, taps his telephone monitors, his movements, and compiles reports on his lover that blend genuine intelligence with straightforward prejudice. When it then uses those files not in a court of law, not in a public inquiry, in private negotiations between prime ministers and archbishops, to manage the outcome of the constitutional crisis. And then what does it mean when a government discovers in the wreckage of a defeated enemy documents that reveal embarrassing truths about its own royal family, in the first instance not to preserve the historical record and suppress it? When the leader of the free world writes to the general who defeated Hitler asking him to help keep documents secret for 2 decades, I want to be clear, I am not suggesting a simple conspiracy or a clean villain. Churchill was trying to protect the monarchy that Britain needed intact to function through post-war years. George VI was trying to shield his brother from what might well be hard German propaganda. The intelligence services genuinely believed they had legitimate security concerns. But there is a recurring pattern here that is worth naming in every phase of this story. When the choice arose between institutional transparency and institutional protection, the same decision was made. Information was suppressed, files were sealed, decades were allowed to pass, and by the time the truth came out, the people most directly affected Edward Wallace, the journalist who had been quietly pressured to say nothing, the historians who had been quietly warned away were either dead. There is one more document in this story that I find particularly haunting, and it does not receive the attention it deserves. June of 1967, 31 years after the abdication, British ambassador to Ireland, a man named Adam Gilchrist, contacted the Irish government. He delivered a message London was not planning to release its abdication records. London would feel able to expect that Dublin would follow suit and would hold the Irish files on the same subject. The Irish government, its own set of diplomatic telegrams and private communications from the 1936 crisis agreed. Officials noted incidentally that they could see no likelihood in the foreseeable future of releasing anything. They carefully recorded the British government's concerns and filed the request away. Those Irish documents were eventually released in December of 2025, 89 years after the application. 89 years. Think about the kind of timescale that represents. The youngest person alive during the abdication crisis in 1936 would be in their late 90s today. But for people who lived through it, who were shaped by it, might have told their own versions of events nearly all of them are gone. The documents arrived after the witnesses had departed. History became available precisely when there was almost nobody left to challenge it, or to add to it from personal memory. I do not think that is entirely a coincidence. I think it is in part the point. Here is what I take from all of this, and it is something I've genuinely wrestled with before deciding how to say it. The abdication has always been told as a love story. Sometimes it gets told as a political story. Occasionally it gets told as a Nazi story. But the story of the secret files, the surveillance, the suppression, 77 years before the MI5 documents came out, the 89 years before Ireland released its diplomatic records, that is something else entirely. It is a story about power and its relationship to the past, about who controls the historical record and for how long and in whose interest, about the institutional instinct found in every government and every palace in every era, about manage inflammation the way gardeners manage unruly growth, not by letting it run, but by deciding carefully what gets to survive. The extraordinary thing in this particular case is that so much has survived anyway. Filing cabinets in universities and boxes at the Public Record Office at Kew, in archives in Dublin and Washington and Marburg, and paper trails proving more durable than the people who wanted to erase it. And what it tells us now, that we can read it incomplete and imperfect as it is that the story we were given in 1936 was not false exactly. But it was not the whole story either. The whole story was more complicated and more uncomfortable, and in some ways more interesting than the official version. The king who was genuinely unsuitable, the woman who was genuinely complicated, the government that was genuinely frightened, and an institution that responded to all of it, the way institutions always respond to what frightens them, by managing the narrative, by buying time, by waiting for the witnesses to age, and by trusting perhaps correctly that the world has a short memory, and that by the time the files come out, most people will have moved on to other stories. We have not quite moved on. You're here after all. And there is one final story in this long chain of events, the story of what it has all added up to, and what kind of monarchy emerged from the wreckage of 1936 that we've not yet told. Because the abdication did not just change the family, it did not just produce echoes in Margaret's heartbreak and Diana's tragedy, and the files in Marburg and the quiet diplomatic telegrams in Dublin. It produced over the course of 80-odd years a set of fundamental questions about what the British monarchy is actually, what it owes the public, what it costs to maintain, and whether the arrangement still makes sense. Those questions, it turns out, are being asked more loudly right now than at almost any point since the 11th of December 1936, when a man stood at a microphone and said he could not carry the weight of the crown without the woman he loved. That is the story of Part 11, and it starts right here. So, here we are. After 10 chapters of this story, the king walked away. The woman the establishment hated, the brother who never wanted the crown, the Nazi shadows, the long exile, the daughter-in-law who nearly brought them down by simply refusing to be invisible, we've arrived at the question that all of it was building toward. What is the British monarchy actually for in the 21st century? Is whatever it is for worth the cost of keeping it? I want to be honest with you, this is the part of the story where I am careful, because these are genuinely contested questions that reasonable people disagree about, but I have no interest in telling you what to think. What I can do is lay out what the numbers say, what history suggests, and leave you to make your own judgment, which is, I think, what any good story should ultimately do. Let's start with some upcoming numbers. Any serious conversation about this subject has to start there. In the financial year that ended in March of 2025, the British government paid the royal household £86.3 million, and what is called the sovereign grant, roughly equivalent to £1.25 per British citizen per year. This grant covers the staffing of royal residences, the maintenance of royal palaces, and the travel costs involved in official engagements. That number in isolation does not sound enormous. It is less than the annual salary budget of a large hospital trust. It is less than the cost of a single modern warship.
One day a week?
The monarchy they are not wrong to do so. But here is the complication. The
Well, I guess we'll get
3 million is
Well,
the officially declared figure. The anti-monarchy campaign group, Public Britain's largest such organisation, founded in 1983, and currently the loudest voice in the debate, argues that the actual cost to British taxpayers is at least 6 times higher once you include the security apparatus, the loss of royal-owned land that goes directly to the palace, relevant to public services, and a range of other costs of year. The official trends, specifically Ritchie in Lancaster.
We're playing with Val.
Portfolio of land
And,
rising and assets in private Crown. Head King Charles had
Yeah,
taken in the last reported year. His son, the Prince of Wales, received
And,
£23.2 million from the pension allowed his estate of 130,000 acres, originally created by King Edward
Yeah.
III in 1337.
Yeah, well,
Directly members of the royal family, and it is that the public
Yeah.
argues should be generating revenue independent services
There,
instead.
don't hit too hard. Yeah, you there.
Why I am reciting its financial details in a series that began as a month's work out of who gave up the scheme. The reason is this: the application of 1936 had
Why do I do that? Whack that
British
damn ball.
establishment decided that the foster constitutional and political reputation of the UK did not throw too high. Let's try to action the same
well,
in the opposite direction. Is the costly
people like this.
institutional to the world for diplomats in return.
No, I'm gonna order up.
Rhetorical question.
What you got to
It is
hit all around?
and the answer is not obvious. Let us look at the over as it tells a genuinely strong story.
He's looking at me.
1983,
You really
organizations
You're trying to kill us. We figure out.
interest group active relevance.
Right over.
British social constituency.
And right on the front.
6% is considered having a monopoly with the either very
Yeah.
or not. 86%. That is not
I'll
the
keep my own.
majority. This is
Give me about
census. In 2024, that number moved to 1%.
Anyway, we get back to the caddy. To the close. I give my card. I give the card. I came in the but I'll tell you, Michael was
The proportion of women in outright abolition had risen from 3% in 1883 to 1724, when the National Centre for Social Research, which had attitudes for over 40 years, published its findings. The research director said,
will be going
it is striking. These data show just how much of food is shifted. The monarchy is now at its lowest level since our records began. Those levels Republic of the monarchy is the question that the next chapter of the story will answer. That chapter has not been written yet, and twelve parts, one scandal, and a question that turns out to have no final answer until the next person waking up or desperate enough to ask it again. Something in the series stayed with you. No one made you stop or made you say something that you knew or a different angle. They would genuinely love to know what it was. Leave it in the comments. Tell me which parts you liked the most. Tell me which video you liked and these conversations are honestly a part of the movies that I value most. If you are watching this for the first time, and there are early chapters you will not necessarily go back to the video, the story genuinely needs to be followed further. Everything that matters in the final chapter is part of the first. You can live the whole journey, all 12 parts, all the way from that point to 1936 present day. Not gonna last. Just breathe and now and over. This kind of story takes a long time to tell well. Everything's worth looking at the ones actually there in the world. They carry themselves to my own. Well, I will see you next one. To marry, too fragile to mother children, too burdensome to manage a home, too unfortunate to be desired. And after 12 men turned me away, each one with a different cruelty dressed up as reason, I began to believe them. Then my father did something so shocking, so unthinkable, so dangerous that if anyone had whispered it aloud in polite society, they would have called him mad. He gave me to an enslaved man, a blacksmith, giant of a man everyone feared. A man they called the Brute, and what began as an arrangement born of desperation became the greatest love of my life. So before this story begins, do me one favor. If you believe the world has always judged too quickly, if you believe the human heart can still surprise us, subscribe now, because what I'm about to tell you is a story. A story that will happen to me. And one never decides otherwise. I'm 8 years old, and it happened. Even after all those years, I can still hear the horse screaming. I can still feel the violent snap of my small body.
talk like two beings discovering that the other truly exists. His thoughts are simple as this. Laughter arrives before being calculated. Silences the need for apology. Cora had spoken about the books she learned to read in secret. About the birds she identified by their song before spotting them. About the smell of fresh roasting coffee into her, always tasting the bottom. To something he hadn't chosen. Calm, control.
He hadn't found it.
Desire to one day just be a man. The hours that already announced the new day. Then his happy gently fell like sleep without him noticing. Now it's done. And it had truly happened. A week later, Lawrence was found unconscious on the road between the plantation and the town. His horse had been swooped by something which pinned him against the rocks. But he regained consciousness. All over his legs, and when Cora tried to find out what had happened, the robot looked at her with his ice-cold eyes and told her she would be sold down in the community if she ever dared to come near the sun again. That was how she arrived at the Baroque Pittsburgh, 16 years old, and once ready without anything. He needed a seat inside her chest. By her side was 6 months of playing myself. What she needed was the arms that I had given to you. Just been an accident to fate. Only it was the way. He was buried decades ago. It was registered in the county courthouse that everyone expected to survive. He truly really hard. Take it to his life and leave it to be secure. The decision of the consequences that Cora would know at stake days later. That would change up the life of the rest of everyone who lived together. What would take is Cora before she could say a word. The only woman with white strings. accident he was different, lighter, more alive. Now he locks himself in his study. Pens orders by written notes, still had nobody come near. The sound of wheels on the wooden floorboards arrived before he did. Forrest stiffened her spine, preparing for what was to come. Lawrence finally unlocked and entered through the side door of the hall in the wooden wheelchair she had placed outside. His shoulders moved at the chin. His large hands rested on the wheels with a familiar that indicated years of practice. So, his deep voice filled the kitchen like thunder fills the night or a storm. You are the one who asked for the position, and her knees weakened. And she had kissed him without his government. She carried in her womb, whose disappearance she had tried entire nights in the Vicksburg slave quarters. Yes, sir, she answered, keeping her voice steady despite the whirlwind churning inside her. My name is Cora. I worked here years ago in Colonel Victor's time. Lawrence studied her from top to bottom, his amber eyes stopping for an instant on her belly, before traveling back up to her face. Something sparked in that look, a flash too quick to be named, before being covered by his usual hardness. setting his neutral expression, when something older and more painful passed through his amber eyes like a storm cloud. The other enslaved workers of the big house noticed the tension between the new house girl and the master, without being able to name it. There was something there that didn't look like the usual dangers a pregnant enslaved woman should fear from a master. It looked, strangely enough, like mutual fear. Laura treated Lawrence with a careful formality that went beyond protocol, but he avoided her with a determination that only obsessive people can keep up. But what she didn't know was that every night the young heir stayed awake in his wheelchair in front of the study window, holding an untouched glass of bourbon and a folded photograph in his pocket, the tintype taken at the Larrabee's party 3 years prior, where a bright-eyed enslaved girl smiled next to a man who could still dance. Something changed that day she went to organize the books in the study. It hurt you.